Imagine dedicating 15 years of your life to a company. Blood, sweat, and tears poured into turning a struggling startup into a $50 million empire. Then one day, the founder's daughter, fresh out of business school with zero industry experience, walks in and fires you. Just like that, 15 years of loyalty erased with a single signature. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. That's exactly what happened to me. What Jessica Warren didn't know when she called security to escort me out of the building was that I owned every patent that kept Axiom Technologies alive. The very innovations that had transformed her father's failing company into an industry leader were legally mine, and I was about to teach her the most expensive business lesson of her life. My story begins in 2008, right as the financial crisis was devastating the economy. I had just graduated from MIT with a master's degree in electrical engineering and a mountain of student debt. The job market was brutal. Companies that had promised positions were now rescinding offers. I sent out hundreds of applications and faced rejection after rejection. Then I found Mason Warren's ad for a junior engineer at a small company called Axiom Technologies. The salary was well below market rate, but I was desperate. When I arrived for the interview, I was shocked by what I saw. The office was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, with water stains on the ceiling and mismatched furniture that looked like it had been rescued from the curb. Mason himself was nothing like I expected. He was in his 50s, with calloused hands and a weathered face that spoke of decades of hard work. He wasn't a tech visionary or a smooth-talking businessman. He was an old-school engineer who had worked in manufacturing for 30 years before trying to start his own company. "I'll be honest with you, kid," Mason said after a brief introduction. "We're on the verge of closing our doors. I've got 2 engineers left, and one of them just gave notice. I can't match what the big companies pay, but I can offer you something." They can't. A chance to build something from the ground up. I appreciated his honesty, and something about his straightforward approach resonated with me. That same day, I met the other employees. Carlos Rodriguez, a brilliant hardware engineer who had been with Mason from the beginning, and Sarah Mitchell, who handled everything from accounting to customer service. "Our product line is outdated," Mason explained as he showed me around. "We make specialized testing equipment for manufacturing facilities, but we haven't innovated in years. The big players are eating our lunch. I was hoping you might have some fresh ideas." I did have ideas. During grad school, I had developed a novel approach to sensor calibration that could drastically improve precision in industrial testing equipment. I had considered trying to patent it myself, but the legal fees were prohibitive for a broke graduate student. When I explained the concept to Mason, his eyes lit up. "That could be exactly what we need," he said. "When can you start?" I started the next day. Mason and I quickly drafted a contract that included a unique arrangement. I would accept a salary 40% below market rate, but I would personally retain ownership of any patents I developed while working at Axiom. The company would have an exclusive licensing agreement to use those patents as long as I remained employed there. It was an unusual arrangement, but Mason was desperate to save his company, and I was hungry for an opportunity to see my innovations come to life. My first 6 months at Axiom were brutal. The company had barely enough cash to keep the lights on. We worked 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week. I slept on a cot in the back office more often than I slept in my own apartment. Carlos and I developed the first prototype of what would eventually become our flagship product, the Axi Precision Sensor Array. When we installed the first unit at a local manufacturing plant, the results exceeded even our own expectations. The precision improvement was dramatic enough that the client immediately ordered systems for their other facilities. Word spread quickly in the industry. Within a year, we had enough orders to hire 3 more engineers and move to a proper office space. During those early years, Mason was the perfect boss. He trusted my technical judgment completely and gave me the freedom to pursue innovations that others might have considered too risky. He protected me from administrative headaches so I could focus on what I did best: inventing. Though he was the founder and CEO, we functioned more like partners. "I know what I don't know," he told me once. "I built mechanical things for 30 years, but this digital revolution, that's your world, not mine. I'm smart enough to get out of your way." By 2014, 6 years after I joined, Axiom had grown to 50 employees and $15 million in annual revenue. My original sensor technology had evolved into a suite of products that were becoming industry standards. I had developed 11 patents, all legally in my name but licensed exclusively to Axiom as per our original agreement. That's when I first met Jessica Warren, Mason's daughter. She was 24 and had just completed her undergraduate business degree. Mason brought her into the office one day, beaming with paternal pride. "Jessica's interested in learning the business," he told me. "She'll be shadowing different departments over the summer." My first impression of Jessica was not positive. While Mason had built his life on hard work and humility, Jessica exuded entitlement. She drove a brand new BMW that Mason had bought her as a graduation present. She spoke constantly about her connections from college and the exclusive parties she attended. What bothered me most was how she talked about Axiom, as if it was her birthright rather than something her father had built through decades of sacrifice. Still, I tried to be welcoming for Mason's sake. I spent days explaining our technology and market position to her. I showed her prototypes of new products we were developing. I even invited her to client meetings so she could see how our technology was implemented in the field. Her response was underwhelming. "This all seems so industrial," she said with a slight curl of her lip. "Have you guys thought about getting into consumer tech? That's where the real money is." I explained that our strength was in precision industrial sensors, a specialized market where we had established expertise and reputation. Pivoting to consumer electronics would mean competing against tech giants with billions in resources. She shrugged. "Just a thought. Seems like you're thinking too small." After her summer internship, Jessica disappeared back to her life of parties and social media influencer aspirations. Mason occasionally mentioned her, always with that same proud smile, but she had little interest in Axiom's day-to-day operations. Meanwhile, the company continued to thrive. By 2018, we had grown to 120 employees and $30 million in revenue. We had moved to a beautiful office building in downtown Columbus. My innovation pipeline had expanded to include 23 patents, all following the same ownership arrangement we had established a decade earlier. Then, in early 2023, everything changed. Mason had a severe heart attack. I was in the middle of a product development meeting when Sarah burst into the room, her face pale. "Mason's in the hospital. It's his heart." For the next 2 weeks, I practically lived at the hospital. Mason had always been more than a boss to me. He was a mentor, a friend, almost a father figure. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but it was clear he wouldn't be returning to work anytime soon. In Mason's absence, I naturally stepped up to lead the company. I had been functioning as the de facto COO for years anyway, though I had resisted taking an official C-suite title, preferring to stay focused on innovation. The transition was seamless. Our executive team had worked together for years, and everyone understood their roles. 3 weeks after Mason's heart attack, I was reviewing quarterly projections with our finance team when Jessica Warren walked into the conference room unannounced. She was dressed in an expensive suit that seemed designed to project authority she hadn't earned. "I need the room," she announced to everyone but me. Confused, our CFO looked to me for guidance. I nodded, and the team filed out. "How's your father doing?" I asked once we were alone. "Stable," she replied curtly. "But his doctors have advised him to retire completely. No work, no stress." "I understand." We've been managing well in his absence, and that's what I came to discuss, she interrupted. Dad has transferred his shares to me. I'm taking over as CEO, effective immediately. The news hit me like a physical blow, not because I coveted the CEO title for myself. I had never wanted that role, but because the announcement came without any prior discussion or consultation. Jessica, I'm not sure that's the best approach right now. You haven't been involved in the company's operations. There's a steep learning curve, and I have an MBA from Wharton now, she cut in, and I've spent the last 2 years at McKinsey. I think I can handle running my father's company. My father's company. That phrase revealed everything about how she viewed Axiom, not as a collaborative creation built through the efforts of dozens of dedicated people, but as a family heirloom that was hers by right. Does Mason know you're here today? I asked. A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed her face. He knows I'm taking over. The details are mine to handle as I see fit. Over the next month, Jessica made a show of evaluating the company's operations. She brought in consultants from her McKinsey days who asked endless questions and produced glossy presentations filled with meaningless business jargon. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with each executive, during which she asked probing questions about their relationships with me. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I tried to make it work, for Mason's sake, and for the company we had built together. I swallowed my pride and offered Jessica my full support. I created detailed briefings on our product roadmap, client relationships, and competitive landscape. I introduced her to our key customers and industry partners. Her response was to sideline me at every opportunity. She excluded me from meetings I had previously led. She redirected my team members to report directly to her. She even moved my office from the executive floor to a small space near the engineering department. The final straw came 6 weeks after her arrival. She called me into a meeting with 2 people I didn't recognize. One was introduced as our new Chief Innovation Officer, a 30-something consultant with no engineering background. The other was from HR. We're restructuring the engineering division, Jessica announced without preamble. As part of that process, we'll be eliminating your position. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. You're firing me. We're eliminating redundancies, the HR representative corrected smoothly. You'll receive a generous severance package in exchange for a standard non-compete agreement. Non-compete? I repeated. Jessica, I built this company alongside your father. Every major product in our catalog is based on my innovations. Innovations you developed as an employee of Axiom, she stated coldly. That's when I realized she had no idea about our patent arrangement. Mason had apparently never explained to his daughter that the intellectual property that formed the backbone of Axiom's success was not actually owned by the company. I could have told her right then. I could have explained that without a licensing agreement with me personally, Axiom would lose the right to use any of my patents. But something in her smug expression stopped me. She had made no effort to understand the company's history or appreciate the contributions of those who had built it. She viewed me as disposable, a line item to be cut to improve the quarterly numbers she could brag about to her business school friends. I'll need to review any severance agreement with my lawyer, I said quietly. Of course, the HR person nodded. In the meantime, we'll need you to hand over your key card. Security will accompany you to collect your personal belongings. As I was being escorted out of the building, I had helped transform from a failing workshop into a $50 million enterprise. I caught a glimpse of Jessica through her office window. She was taking a selfie behind Mason's old desk, probably for her Instagram. She didn't even look up as I left. What she didn't know was that I was walking out with something far more valuable than a corner office or an executive title. I was walking out with the legal rights to every piece of intellectual property that made Axiom Technologies successful. and I was about to remind her of exactly who had built her father's company. I didn't go straight home after being escorted out of Axiom. Instead, I drove to the hospital to see Mason. I needed to understand if he truly supported Jessica's decision or if she was acting unilaterally. The nursing staff recognized me immediately. I'd been a fixture at Mason's bedside. For weeks, his room was filled with sunlight, cards from employees decorating every surface. When he saw me, his face brightened, then quickly clouded with concern. "You heard," he said weakly. I pulled a chair beside his bed. "Jessica fired me today. Security. Walked me out like a criminal." Mason closed his eyes, pain etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "That wasn't what I wanted. I told her to work with you, to learn from you." "Did you tell her about our patent arrangement?" His eyes opened. Confusion evident. Of course. It was one of the first things I explained when I signed the company over. The patents, the licensing agreement, everything. That revelation hit me hard. Jessica hadn't acted out of ignorance. She had deliberately ignored critical information about the company's intellectual property. Either she hadn't believed her father, or worse, she thought she could intimidate me into surrendering my rights. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," Mason continued, using my first name as he rarely did. "This isn't what I built Axiom for. Not to discard people who gave everything to make it succeed." I squeezed his hand gently. "Rest and focus on getting better. I'll figure this out." As I left the hospital, my phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. "Emergency meeting called. Jessica, announcing new direction." What the hell is happening? I didn't respond. Carlos was a good friend, but I couldn't put him in the middle of what was coming. The next morning, I contacted Patricia Alvarez, a patent attorney I had worked with over the years to file my innovations. She agreed to meet immediately. Her corner, office in downtown Columbus offered a view of Axiom's headquarters, a coincidence that felt symbolic. "They can't simply pretend your patents don't exist," Patricia said after reviewing our situation. "Your agreement with Mason was unorthodox, but perfectly legal. You own those patents. Axiom's right to use them was contingent on your employment." "So, what happens now?" I asked. "Technically, every Axiom product using your patents is now in violation of your intellectual property rights. We can file for an immediate injunction to stop production, sales, everything." The power of that statement wasn't lost on me. With a single legal filing, I could effectively shut down the company I had helped build for 15 years. "That feels too nuclear," I said after a moment. "These are people's livelihoods we're talking about. People like Carlos who have families depending on them." Patricia nodded, understanding my hesitation. "There's another approach. We send a formal notice indicating your willingness to negotiate a new licensing agreement. It gives them a chance to rectify the situation before we escalate to legal action." That afternoon, Patricia drafted the notice. It was clinical and precise, laying out the facts without emotion. I owned 23 patents currently being used by Axiom Technologies. Their license to use those patents had terminated with my employment. I was open to negotiating a new licensing agreement provided the terms were fair. 2 days passed with no response. Then, on the third morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Axiom's main number. "This is Ethan," I answered. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Jessica Warren." Her voice was tight, controlled. "I received a rather surprising letter from your attorney." "Not as surprising as being fired from the company I helped build from nothing. Let's not be dramatic. My father founded Axiom. You were an employee who was compensated for your work." I took a deep breath. "Jessica, I'm not sure you fully understand the situation. Every significant product in Axiom's catalog is built on my intellectual property. Without a licensing agreement with me, you cannot legally manufacture or sell those products." There was a pause, then a forced laugh. "Our legal team has reviewed your claims. The patents were developed while you were employed by Axiom, using company resources. They belong to the company. That's not what my contract states, and your father will confirm it. We had a specific agreement about patent ownership from day one. My father is an old man who made a terrible business decision, she snapped, her composure cracking. No competent CEO would allow an employee to retain ownership of mission-critical intellectual property. Your father is a man of integrity who understands the value of partnership. He couldn't pay market rate, so he offered something else of value. It was a fair arrangement that benefited both of us for 15 years. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her recalculating. What do you want? She finally asked. A fair licensing agreement and respect for the people who built Axiom alongside your father. No more arbitrary firings or restructurings. You expect me to let you dictate how I run my company? The indignation in her voice was palpable. No, I expect you to run it with the same integrity your father did. But since that doesn't seem possible, I'll settle for a licensing agreement that protects both the company and my interests. And if I refuse? Then Patricia files for an injunction tomorrow morning, and Axiom stops selling products until this is resolved in court. The line went silent for so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke with ice in her voice. Fine. Have your lawyer contact our legal team. The negotiations that followed were brutal. Jessica brought in aggressive corporate attorneys who attempted every possible angle to invalidate my patent claims. They argued that my innovations were derivative works based on Axiom's existing technology. They claimed that company resources had been used for development, negating our agreement. They even suggested that Mason had not been of sound mind when he agreed to the original terms. None of it held up against the documented evidence. My original contract, 15 years of consistent patent filings, and Mason's own testimony once. He was well enough to provide it. After 6 weeks of back and forth, Jessica finally conceded reality. We reached an agreement. I would license my parents to Axiom for a 5% royalty on gross sales of any product using my intellectual property. Additionally, I would have veto power over any personnel changes involving the original engineering team. It wasn't about controlling the company, it was about protecting the people who had built it alongside me. The day after signing the agreement, I received an unexpected visitor at my home. Carlos arrived with a 6-pack of the craft beer we used to share during late-night engineering sessions in the early days. "You magnificent bastard," he said with a grin as I opened the door. You should have seen Jessica's face when the lawyers explained the new arrangement. I thought she was going to spontaneously combust. We settled on my back porch, the evening sun casting long shadows across the yard. "So what happened at that emergency meeting after I left?" I asked. Carlos popped open 2 beers. Pure theater. Jessica presented herself as the visionary savior who would modernize her father's outdated company. She announced a pivot toward consumer tech, wearables, smart home devices, all that trending stuff we specifically avoided because it's not our expertise. "How's that going?" "Exactly as you'd expect. The prototype team has been spinning their wheels for weeks. They've got nobody with consumer electronics experience, and the designs they're producing are 3 years behind what's already on the market." He took a long sip. "But that's not even the best part." "What is?" "The exodus. After you were escorted out, morale collapsed. 20 people resigned within 2 weeks. Most of the senior engineers already have offers elsewhere. I was planning to leave myself before this licensing agreement saved us. She's going to fire me again when she realizes I negotiated veto power over engineering layoffs," I predicted. Carlos laughed. "She can't. That's the beauty of it. The agreement specifically states that any attempt to terminate the licensing agreement triggers an immediate triple increase in royalty rates. Her lawyers made sure she understood that part." I shook my head. I never wanted it to come to this. Mason and I built something special. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about the culture, the people. Speaking of Mason, Carlos said, his expression turning serious. He's been asking about you, says he has a proposition. 2 days later, I found myself back in Mason's hospital room. His color had improved, and he was sitting up in a chair instead of lying in bed, promising signs of recovery. Ethan, he greeted me warmly. Thank you for coming, and thank you for not destroying my company, even though my daughter gave you every reason to. I didn't build Axiom just to tear it down, I replied. Neither did I, he said with a pointed look. Which brings me to why I asked you here today. Mason explained that his heart attack had forced him to confront some hard truths. He had built Axiom hoping it would become a legacy for his family, but in the process, he had failed to instill the values that made the company special in the first place. Jessica sees Axiom as an asset, not a community, he said with sadness. That's my failure as a father. I gave her things instead of teaching her principles. She's young, I offered, though without much conviction. Maybe with time. Mason shook his head. She's 31, not 18. Old enough to know better. He straightened in his chair. I've made a decision. I'm creating a new holding company. For my remaining Axiom shares. I want you to run it. I stared at him, stunned. Mason, those shares should stay in your family. My company is my family, he replied firmly. You, Carlos, Sarah. You're the ones who built Axiom with me. You're the ones who understand what it stands for. Over the next hour, Mason outlined his plan. He still owned 51% of Axiom's shares, despite transferring operational control to Jessica. He would place those shares in a voting trust with myself, Carlos, and Sarah as trustees. We would have control over major company decisions, while Jessica would maintain day-to-day operational authority, provided she adhered to the company's core values and strategic direction. She'll fight this, I warned. Let her, Mason said with a determined glint in his eye. I built that company from nothing. I have the right to ensure it continues with the values that made it successful. As predicted, Jessica was furious when Mason's lawyers presented the new arrangement. She threatened litigation, public relations warfare, even exposing corporate secrets to competitors. None of it fazed Mason. His mind was made up. The confrontation came to a head in the Axiom boardroom 3 months after my firing. Mason, now recovered enough to attend in person, called a special board meeting. Jessica arrived flanked by her McKinsey consultants and corporate attorneys. I was there with Carlos and Sarah as the newly appointed trustees. This is a hostile takeover, Jessica declared as soon as the meeting began. No, Mason corrected calmly. This is responsible stewardship. You will remain CEO. You will draw your salary and bonuses. But major strategic decisions and personnel changes will require trustee approval. You're embarrassing me in front of the entire industry, she hissed. I'm preventing you from dismantling 15 years of hard work because you want to chase business school buzzwords, Mason replied, a rare edge in his voice. Axiom succeeds because we understand our market, we value our people, and we focus on excellence in a specific niche, not because we chase whatever is trending in Silicon Valley. The legal battle lasted another month, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Mason's majority ownership gave him the right to structure the company's governance as he saw fit. Jessica finally conceded, though the frost in her eyes whenever we were in the same room suggested the war wasn't truly over. 1 year later, Axiom Technologies crossed the $75 million revenue mark, a 50% increase from when I had been fired. The core business of precision industrial sensors had expanded with new innovations from the engineering team, now freed from Jessica's misguided pivot to consumer tech. We had even acquired 2 smaller competitors, strengthening our position in the marketplace. Jessica remained as CEO, though her role had evolved. To my surprise, she had proven adaptable once the initial conflict was resolved. She excelled at client relations and marketing, areas where her social skills and business Education actually added value. With the guardrails of the trustee structure in place, her ambition became an asset rather than a liability. As for me, I returned to Axiom not as an employee, but as chairman of the board. A position Mason insisted I take when he decided to retire. Fully. My parents remained independently owned but licensed to the company under our agreement. The arrangement preserved my autonomy while ensuring Axiom's continued success. Mason comes by the office occasionally, ostensibly to check on things, but really just to reconnect with the people who had been his work family for decades. During one such visit, I found him sitting in the innovation lab, watching Carlos and the newer engineers debate the merits of a prototype design. "I made a lot of mistakes with Jessica," he said quietly as I joined him. "Gave her too much, expected too little. But I got one thing right with Axiom." "What's that?" I asked. He looked at me with clear eyes, the wisdom of his years evident in his gaze. I recognized that true value isn't in patents or products or profit margins. It's in people who believe in building something that matters. That lesson, the one Jessica had initially failed to grasp, ultimately saved the company we had all worked so hard to build. I still owned the patents, but Mason had always owned the vision. Between the two, the vision was far more valuable. And now, Jessica was finally beginning to understand that too. 3 years after the boardroom showdown, Axiom Technologies had become a case study in corporate transformation. The $75 million company was now approaching $120 million in annual revenue, with offices in 4 cities and a growing international presence. The trust structure Mason had established proved more visionary than any of us had initially realized. What surprised everyone, myself included, was Jessica's evolution. Once the power struggle ended, she channeled her ambition in remarkable ways. Her Wharton education and McKinsey training became assets rather than liabilities when properly directed. She excelled at opening doors that had previously been closed. To us, particularly in the aerospace and defense sectors where relationships often mattered more than technology specs. One Tuesday morning, Jessica requested a private meeting, something that would have been unimaginable during our earlier conflict. "I need your perspective on something," she said, as we settled in a small conference room away from the executive offices. The humility in her tone was still new enough to be surprising. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal from TechCore Industries, one of the largest technology conglomerates in the country. They were offering to acquire Axiom for $200 million. "That's substantial," I said, reviewing the terms. "It's almost twice our current valuation," Jessica agreed. "The board would have a fiduciary responsibility to seriously consider it." I studied her expression, trying to discern her thoughts. "What's your position?" 3 years ago, I would have pushed for acceptance without hesitation. Cash out, move on to the next venture. She paused, a flash of vulnerability crossing her. I said, "But now, I'm not sure. What's changed?" She considered the question carefully. "I understand what my father built now, what you all built together. It's not just a balance sheet or a market position. It's a community with shared values and purpose." The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica had come full circle, finally grasping what Mason had tried to instill in her from the beginning. "Besides," she added with unexpected self-awareness, "the trust structure means I couldn't push the sale through unilaterally, even if I wanted to." "True," I acknowledged, "though I suspect your father would support your recommendation if you believed it was the right move." "Is it?" she asked earnestly. "The right move." That she would seek my guidance on something so consequential demonstrated how far we'd come. "I think that depends on what we want Axiom to be over the next decade. TechCore would certainly provide resources we can't match independently, but their corporate culture is different." "By different, you mean cutthroat and quarterly focused," Jessica translated with surprising candor. I nodded. They acquire companies for technology assets, not people. The Axiom community would likely be dismantled within a year. Jessica was quiet for a moment, then gathered the acquisition papers and returned them to the folder. That's what I needed to hear. I'll inform TechCore we're not interested. As she stood to leave, I felt compelled to acknowledge the moment. Your father would be proud of who you've become. A mix of emotions crossed her face: pride, regret, determination. I spent years resenting him for not simply handing me control of my inheritance. Now I understand he was protecting his legacy until I was ready to be its steward. She gave me a rueful smile. And he was right that I wasn't ready 3 years ago. After she left, I sat reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The contentious firing, the patent standoff, the governance restructuring. All painful at the time, yet necessary for Axiom's evolution. Sometimes organizations, like people, needed crisis to catalyze growth. The following month, Mason called an unusual gathering at his home. He invited the original team members, myself, Carlos, Sarah, along with Jessica and a few key executives who had joined during the company's expansion. His health had improved substantially, but at 72, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned the hard way not to rush. I wanted to share something with all of you, he said once we were settled in his living room. Something I've been working on privately. He distributed bound packets to each person. The cover read simply, Axiom Foundation. What is this? Jessica asked, flipping through the pages. The next phase, Mason explained. I've established a foundation with an initial endowment of $30 million, most of my personal stake in Axiom. Its mission is twofold. First, to fund engineering scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford college, and second, to provide seed funding for startups committed to the same values that built Axiom. We all exchanged glances, surprised by the scope of Mason's vision. So the Foundation will hold 20% of Axiom's shares in perpetuity, he continued. The dividends will fund its operations. And I want all of you to serve as its governing board. Dad, this is... Jessica struggled to find words. My actual legacy, Mason finished for her. Not just a company, but a vehicle for the values that built it to continue influencing the world long after I'm gone. He turned to me specifically. Ethan, your patent arrangement gave me the idea. You found a way to maintain personal ownership while ensuring your innovations benefited the greater good. The foundation does something similar but at a larger scale. The comparison was profound. My patent strategy had been initially self-protective, a way to safeguard my innovations while working for a struggling startup. Mason had transformed the B concept into something far more expansive, a perpetual engine for opportunity and innovation. The foundation launched 6 months later with its first cohort of scholarship recipients, 12 brilliant young engineers from backgrounds much like my own 15 years earlier. Jessica personally mentored several of them, something none of us could have imagined during our earlier conflicts. As Axiom approached its 20th anniversary, an unexpected visitor arrived at our headquarters. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the CEO of TechCore Industries, requested a meeting with both Jessica and myself. Given TechCore's earlier acquisition attempt, we approached the meeting with curiosity and caution. Thank you for seeing me, Dr. Chen began once pleasantries were exchanged. I'll be direct. TechCore has traditionally grown through acquisition, absorbing smaller companies with promising technology. Your rejection of our offer was educational. Jessica and I exchanged glances. How so? I asked. It forced us to examine why a company would decline an objectively generous valuation. Our research into Axiom revealed something we hadn't fully appreciated: the power of continuity and shared purpose in fostering innovation. Dr. Chen slid a document across the table, Not another acquisition offer, but a partnership proposal. TechCore wanted to license Axiom's sensor technology for integration into their consumer products while investing in joint research initiatives. We've found that our acquisition strategy often destroys the very magic that made target companies valuable in the first place, Dr. Chen admitted. Your rejection made us reconsider our approach. We'd like to learn from your model while providing resources that can accelerate your growth. The irony was striking. Jessica's initial vision of pivoting Axiom toward consumer technology had been misguided when attempted unilaterally. Now, through partnership rather than acquisition, that same vision could be realized without abandoning our core identity. The TechCore partnership marked the beginning of Axiom's third evolution. Our precision sensors found new applications in consumer devices, medical equipment, and smart infrastructure. Revenue doubled within 2 years, crossing $250 million. Our workforce expanded to over 500 people across 3 continents. Throughout this growth, the governance structure Mason had established ensured we remained anchored to our founding principles. The trust preserved our strategic autonomy, while the foundation reminded us that success was measured in more than financial metrics. On the 25th anniversary of Axiom's founding, we gathered for a celebration that few could have envisioned. During those early days in the converted warehouse, Mason, now in his mid-80s but still sharp, addressed the assembled employees and partners. When I started this company, he began, his voice still carrying the authoritative tone of an engineer who knew his craft, I thought I was building testing equipment. What I didn't realize was that Axiom itself was the test, a test of whether a business could succeed while prioritizing values over valuation, people over profit margins. He gestured toward Jessica and myself, standing side by side. These two taught me the most important lesson of my career. Jessica showed me that even the most rigid perspectives can evolve when given the right structure and motivation. And Ethan demonstrated that innovation thrives best when personal ownership and collective purpose are balanced, not opposed. The wisdom in Mason's observation struck me profoundly. My patent ownership arrangement, initially a practical solution to Axiom's inability to pay competitive salaries, had evolved into a model that influenced the company's entire approach to innovation. Employees now participated in patent ownership across the organization, creating a culture where intellectual contribution was valued alongside operational excellence. Jessica, too, had incorporated lessons from our conflict into her leadership philosophy. The arbitrary authority she had initially wielded had been replaced by collaborative governance. She had become a formidable CEO precisely because she had learned to balance decisive action with respectful stewardship. After the celebration, Mason asked me to walk with him through the innovation lab, still his favorite part of the company. Among the cutting-edge equipment and prototype displays, he paused beside a humble glass case containing Axiom's first product, the crude testing device that had barely kept the company afloat before my arrival. "Do you remember what you said when I interviewed you?" he asked. I smiled at the memory. "I believe I said something about not wanting to work for a company on the verge of bankruptcy." Mason chuckled. "And I said I couldn't offer you big money, but I could offer you something else. The chance to build something from the ground up," I finished. "Look what you built, Ethan." His gesture encompassed not just the physical space, but everything Axiom had become. Far more than patents or products. You built a legacy. The word resonated differently now than it had when Jessica first took over. Then, legacy had been about inheritance and control. Now it represented something deeper, the enduring impact of values translated into action over decades. 2 years after the anniversary celebration, Mason passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral brought together hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, employees past and present, scholarship recipients, competitors who had become collaborators, and countless others who had been influenced by his approach to business and life. Jessica delivered the eulogy with a grace and wisdom that would have been unimaginable during our earlier conflicts. "My father taught me that a true legacy isn't something you inherit," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "It's something you earn the right to continue." After the service, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter Mason had written, years earlier, to be delivered after his death. The contents were brief but profound. "Ethan, you came to Axiom looking for a job. What you found instead was a purpose. The patents were never the most valuable things you created. It was the culture of innovation and integrity that will outlast all of us. Thank you for teaching me as much as I taught you. Keep building. Mason." As I drove home from the funeral, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this point. The confrontation with Jessica had been painful, even traumatic, at the time. Her firing me after 15 years of dedication had felt like the ultimate betrayal. Yet without that crisis, Axiom might never have evolved into the company it became. Sometimes the most valuable innovations aren't technological at all, but structural and cultural. Mason's trust and foundation, Jessica's evolution from entitled heir to visionary CEO, my own transformation from employee to chairman, each represented a reimagining of what business relationships could be. The patents that had sparked our conflict were still legally mine, now numbering over 50. But their true value had never been in the legal ownership. It was in how they had served as a catalyst for building something far more meaningful than any single invention could be. A month after Mason's funeral, the first graduates of our scholarship program joined Axiom as full-time engineers. Among them was a brilliant young woman named Zoe Patterson, who reminded me strikingly of myself at that age, full of ideas, but lacking the resources to bring them to life. During her onboarding, I shared the original contract Mason and I had drafted. The unconventional agreement that had allowed a struggling company to attract talent it couldn't afford and an ambitious engineer to protect innovations he couldn't develop alone. "This seems so unorthodox," Zoe said, studying the yellowed pages. "Did you have any idea what it would lead to?" I smiled, thinking of Mason's letter. "No, I thought I was just negotiating for a job. What I was actually doing was helping design a community." "And now?" she asked. "What are we designing together?" The question captured perfectly what Mason had understood all along. The most powerful designs weren't products or patents or even companies. They were frameworks for human collaboration that unleashed creativity while honoring dignity. "The future," I answered simply, just like Mason taught us to do. As Axiom continues to evolve beyond its founder's original vision, that remains our guiding principle. We're not just building technology, we're building possibilities. And that, ultimately, is a legacy worth protecting. 5 years after Mason's passing, Axiom Technologies had evolved into something even he might not have fully envisioned. The $250 million company now approached the billion-dollar threshold, milestone that placed us among the elite tier of technology enterprises. What made this achievement remarkable wasn't just the financial growth, but how we'd maintained our core identity throughout the expansion. The partnership with TechCore had blossomed into a collaborative ecosystem that transformed both organizations. Our precision sensor technology had become the industry standard across multiple sectors, while TechCore's distribution channels and manufacturing capacity allowed us to scale in ways we couldn't have achieved independently. One crisp autumn morning, I arrived at our headquarters to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby. Kenneth Warren, Mason's son and Jessica's younger brother. Unlike Jessica, Kenneth had never shown interest in Axiom. After college, he had pursued a career in environmental conservation, working with wildlife preservation programs in Alaska and later South America. I had met him only a handful of times at family functions. Mason had hosted. "Kenneth," I greeted him with genuine surprise. "This is unexpected." He smiled apologetically. I know I'm showing up unannounced. I was hoping I could speak with you and Jessica together. Curious, I escorted him to Jessica's office. She was equally surprised by her brother's appearance. Ken, what are you doing here? She rose to embrace him. Though they had never been particularly close, Mason's passing had softened the distance between them. I've been doing some thinking, Kenneth began once we were all seated. About Dad, about Axiom, about the foundation. Something in his tone made me sit up straighter. Kenneth had inherited a portion of Mason's shares, about 15% of the company, but had remained a passive investor, allowing the trust to vote his shares by proxy. I've spent years focused on environmental protection, he continued, but I've come to realize that technology, the right kind of technology, might be the most powerful conservation tool we have. He produced a thick folder filled with research, papers, photographs, and technical diagrams. The rainforest preservation project I've been working with is facing a critical problem. We can identify illegal logging activities through satellite imagery. But by the time we process the data, the damage is already done. Jessica leaned forward, her business instincts engaged. You need real-time monitoring. Kenneth nodded. Exactly. And not just monitoring, but a system that can alert local authorities immediately when unauthorized activity is detected. I began, to see where this was leading. You're thinking our sensor technology could be adapted for environmental monitoring. More than adapted, Kenneth said with unexpected passion. Reimagined. What if Axiom created an entirely new division focused on environmental technology? Sensors that could detect illegal logging, poaching, water contamination, deployed at scale across vulnerable ecosystems. The concept was ambitious but not implausible. Our miniaturized sensor arrays could theoretically be modified for these applications, and our partnership with TechCore provided access to satellite integration expertise. Jessica and I exchanged evaluative glances. This would require significant investment, she noted, and the potential for immediate return is uncertain at best. I know, Kenneth acknowledged. That's why I've come with more than just an idea. He slid forward a document, a formal proposal, to convert his entire ownership stake into a specialized investment fund dedicated to developing environmental applications of Axiom's technology. I'm prepared to pledge my shares as seed capital, he explained. This isn't about profit for me. It's about purpose. But I believe it could eventually become a viable business segment while doing tremendous good. The proposal was surprisingly sophisticated. Kenneth had clearly invested considerable thought into how Axiom's capabilities could be leveraged for environmental protection without compromising our financial stability. You've given this serious consideration, I observed. More than consideration, Kenneth replied. I've spent the past year consulting with environmental scientists, technology experts, and impact investors. This isn't a passing interest. It's where I want to dedicate my professional life. What struck me most about the moment was how it echoed Axiom's founding. Mason had created the company with a clear vision but limited resources. I had joined with innovative ideas but needed a platform to develop them. Now Kenneth was offering a bold new direction, bringing both vision and resources to the table. I'd need to review the technical feasibility, I said cautiously. And I'd need to evaluate the business model, Jessica added, already thinking like the CEO she had become. Kenneth smiled. I expected nothing less from either of you. Dad always said Axiom succeeded because it combined vision with pragmatism. Over the following weeks, the three of us worked closely to refine Kenneth's proposal. Jessica brought in our financial team to model various scenarios, while I assembled a task force of engineers to assess the technical challenges. Kenneth served as the bridge to environmental organizations and potential deployment partners. The culmination of this work was presented at a special board meeting 3 months later. The proposal had evolved into something more substantial than any of us had initially envisioned. Axiom Earth, a semi-autonomous division focused exclusively on environmental monitoring and protection technology. The financial projections suggest a 7-year path to profitability, Jessica explained to the board, displaying charts that showed the expected investment requirements and revenue trajectories. However, the reputational value and partnership opportunities would begin generating indirect benefits within 18 months. I followed with the technical assessment. We've identified 12 existing patents that can be adapted for environmental applications with modest modifications. Additionally, this initiative would likely generate at least 8 new patents within the first 3 years, expanding our intellectual property portfolio in valuable directions. Kenneth concluded the presentation by outlining the impact potential. By year 5, we estimate this technology could help protect over 50 million acres of critical habitat across 3 continents, while generating actionable intelligence for law enforcement agencies combating environmental crimes. The board deliberation was thorough, but ultimately favorable. With the trust's backing and Kenneth's share pledge, Axiom Earth was approved with an initial 5-year funding commitment. The launch of Axiom Earth marked yet another evolution in the company's journey. What had begun as a struggling industrial testing equipment manufacturer had expanded into precision sensors, then consumer technology partnerships, and now environmental protection. Each phase had built upon the previous foundations while opening new horizons. Kenneth relocated to Columbus to lead the new division, bringing with him a network of environmental scientists and conservation experts. His approach to leadership differed markedly from both Jessica's polished corporate style and my innovation-focused methodology, yet it worked remarkably well within the unique constraints of environmental technology development. 18 months into the initiative, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Eleanor Chen of TechCore. Our partnership had continued to flourish, but her direct outreach outside our regular governance meetings was unusual. "Ethan," she began without preamble, "I've been following Axiom Earth's development with great interest. The satellite integration work is particularly impressive." "Thank you," I replied. "Kenneth has assembled an exceptional team. The combination of environmental expertise and sensor technology is proving more powerful than we anticipated." "That's precisely why I'm calling," Dr. Chen continued. "TechCore's board has authorized me to propose a special investment specifically in Axiom Earth. Not an acquisition, we've learned that lesson, but an expanded partnership with dedicated resources." The proposal she outlined was substantial. TechCore would contribute $100 million in development funding along with access to their global satellite network in exchange for a minority stake in Axiom Earth specifically, leaving the parent company's ownership structure unchanged. "May I ask what prompted this interest?" I inquired, curious about the timing. Dr. Chen's response was enlightening. "2 factors. First, the initial field tests of your rainforest monitoring system demonstrated accuracy levels our analysts didn't believe possible in those conditions. Second, and perhaps more significantly, the United Nations Climate Summit next month is expected to announce major funding initiatives for technological solutions to environmental monitoring. The timing indeed seemed fortuitous. With TechCore's investment and infrastructure support, we could accelerate Axiom Earth's development timeline dramatically, potentially positioning our technology as the standard for the anticipated UN initiatives. After consulting with Jessica and Kenneth, we accepted TechCore's proposal with specific governance protections that maintained Axiom's control over the technology's applications. The influx of resources allowed Kenneth to expand his team from 30 engineers to over 100 within 6 months. The UN Climate Summit unfolded exactly as Dr. Chen had predicted. A coalition of developed nations pledged $2 billion toward a global environmental monitoring network to enforce new international agreements on habitat protection. With our technology already demonstrating success in pilot programs across 3 continents, Axiom Earth secured a leading role in the initiative. What had begun as Kenneth's idealistic vision was now positioned to become Axiom's largest growth segment over the next decade. The market for environmental technology, once considered a niche with limited commercial potential, was emerging as a global priority with substantial funding behind it. On the third anniversary of Axiom Earth's founding, we gathered for a field demonstration in the Amazon rainforest. Jessica, Kenneth, and I, along with key engineers and environmental partners, traveled to a remote monitoring station where our sensor network had been deployed. As we hiked through dense undergrowth, guided by local conservation officers, Kenneth pointed out tiny devices barely larger than a postage stamp affixed to trees at strategic intervals. Each sensor monitors approximately 50 acres, he explained, with evident pride. They detect sound patterns, vibration signatures, air quality changes, anything that might indicate unauthorized activity. When triggered, they triangulate the disturbance and relay coordinates to enforcement teams. We reached a small clearing where a simple structure housed the central monitoring station. Inside, screens displayed real-time data from thousands of sensors spread across hundreds of square miles of rainforest. 3 months ago, this system detected and helped intercept 7 separate illegal logging operations, the station supervisor reported. The response time has been reduced from days to hours, and in some cases, minutes. Jessica, whose initial skepticism about Axiom Earth had been purely business-driven, studied the displays with genuine appreciation. "Kenneth," she said quietly, "Dad would have been incredibly proud of this." It was the first time I had heard her acknowledge her brother's achievement so directly. For all her growth as a leader, Jessica still struggled sometimes with recognizing success that wasn't directly of her own making. "Both of you are extending what Mason built in ways he couldn't have imagined," I observed. Jessica through business acumen, Kenneth through environmental vision. As we flew back to Columbus the following day, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey from my firing to the present moment. The crisis that had seemed so devastating had ultimately catalyzed multiple transformations, not just in the company's structure and market position, but in the people who guided its evolution. Jessica, once the entitled heir who had viewed Axiom as her personal property, had become a steward who understood the deeper value of what her father had created. Kenneth, who had initially rejected any involvement with the family business, had found a way to align his environmental passion with Axiom's technological capabilities. And I had evolved from employee to chairman, from innovator to mentor. Even the patents that had sparked the original conflict had been transformed in meaning. What began as a practical arrangement between a cash-strapped startup and an ambitious engineer had evolved into a model for how intellectual property could serve multiple purposes simultaneously: commercial success, personal recognition, and, now, global impact. 2 years after the Amazon demonstration, Axiom Technologies crossed the billion-dollar valuation threshold. The achievement was celebrated not with exclusive executive parties, but with a company-wide initiative. Every employee received shares equivalent to 20% of their annual salary, along with the opportunity to direct company donations to causes they valued personally. At the formal ceremony marking the milestone, Jessica, Kenneth, and I unveiled something that surprised even our long-term employees. A life-sized bronze statue of Mason in the headquarters lobby, depicted not in a formal pose but as we had known him best. Sleeves rolled up, examining a circuit board with focused attention. The plaque beneath it bore a simple inscription: Mason Warren, founder of Axiom Technologies. He built more than a company. He built a legacy of innovation with integrity. Jessica delivered remarks that would have been unimaginable during our earlier conflicts. When I took over Axiom after my father's heart attack, I made a fundamental mistake, she acknowledged openly. I thought leadership meant control, and success meant imposing my vision regardless of context or history. She gestured toward me. It took someone with the courage to stand firm, even at personal risk, to show me that true leadership is stewardship, not ownership. Ethan could have destroyed Axiom when I fired him. Instead, he found a path that protected both his innovations and the company built upon them. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Kenneth found me on the building's rooftop terrace, gazing out at the Columbus skyline. "You know what I find most remarkable about all this?" he said, joining me at the railing. "What's that?" "How the worst moment in your professional life, being fired after 15 years of dedication, ultimately created space for possibilities none of us could have envisioned." The observation struck me as profoundly true. Had I remained in my original role, comfortable and unchallenged, would Axiom have evolved as it had? Would Jessica have developed into the leader she became? Would Kenneth have found a way to bridge his environmental passion with the family business? "Crisis reveals character," I replied after a thoughtful pause. "Your father told me that once during the 2008 recession when we were fighting to keep the company alive. I don't think I fully understood what he meant until later." Kenneth nodded. "Jessica told me about those early agreements you made, the patents, the licensing arrangement. At first, it seemed like an odd way to structure things, but now I see how brilliant it was. It forced everyone to respect each other's contributions. That was the essence of what Mason had built. Not just a company, but a framework for collaborative innovation where individual contribution and collective purpose reinforced rather than opposed each other. My patent ownership had never been about control or leverage. It had been about recognition and mutual respect. As Axiom continues its journey beyond the billion-dollar threshold, that fundamental principle remains our guiding star. Ownership, whether of patents, shares, or ideas, is valuable only when it serves a purpose beyond itself. True innovation emerges not from protecting intellectual property, but from deploying it in service of meaningful progress. The boss's daughter, who fired me after I built the company to $50 million, had no idea I owned the patents that kept the enterprise alive. But the lesson that emerged from that conflict wasn't about legal leverage or corporate control. It was about how crisis can transform both organizations and individuals when navigated with integrity. Mason Warren built a company. Together, we built a legacy. And that legacy continues to evolve in ways that honor its foundations while embracing new horizons, exactly as it should. A decade after Mason's passing, Axiom Technologies had transformed beyond what any of us could have imagined in those early days. The billion-dollar valuation had more than tripled, with Axiom Earth growing into the company's largest division. What began as Kenneth's idealistic vision now accounted for over 40% of our total revenue, with deployments across 6 continents protecting critical ecosystems from the Amazon to the Arctic. Jessica had evolved into a respected industry leader, regularly invited to speak at global business forums on ethical leadership and sustainable growth. The ambitious yet entitled heir who had once fired me out of misplaced pride now embodied the values her father had tried to instill. At 51, she carried herself with quiet confidence born of earned wisdom rather than inherited position. Kenneth, at 45, had become something of a celebrity in environmental circles. The businessman turned conservationist who had bridged the gap between technology and ecological protection. His unorthodox path from reluctant inheritor to visionary leader had inspired a generation of young entrepreneurs to view business as a vehicle for positive change rather than merely profit. As for me, approaching 65, I had begun the process of stepping back from day-to-day operations. While I remained chairman of the board, my focus had shifted toward mentoring emerging talent and guiding the company's long-term innovation strategy. The patents that had once been at the center of our conflict now numbered over 100, each, one a testament to Axiom's culture of innovation with integrity. One crisp autumn morning, remarkably similar to the day Kenneth had first appeared in our lobby with his environmental proposal, I received an unexpected visitor in my office. Zoe Patterson, the brilliant young engineer who had reminded me of myself in the early days, now led our advanced research division after a meteoric rise through the organization. "Do you have a moment?" she asked, hovering in my doorway with an expression I recognized immediately, the look of someone with an idea too big to contain. Of course, I gestured to the chair across from my desk. What's on your mind? Zoe settled in, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. I've been developing something, independently, she finally said, using Axiom resources for testing, but on my own time. Her words triggered an immediate sense of déjà vu, echoing conversations I had with Mason decades earlier. Tell me about it, I encouraged. It's a neural interface for prosthetics, she explained, growing animated. Completely different from our existing sensor applications, but building on the same foundational principles. The potential applications for disabled veterans alone could be transformative. As she outlined her innovation, I was struck by both its brilliance and its divergence from Axiom's current focus areas. It wasn't merely an extension of existing technology, but a lateral leap that opened entirely new possibilities. This could be significant, I acknowledged when she finished. Have you discussed it with Jessica or the R&D leadership? Zoe shook her head. That's why I'm here. The technology has tremendous potential, but it would require Axiom to enter the medical sector, a regulatory environment we've never navigated before. And you're concerned about how the company would approach ownership of the innovation, I guessed, seeing the parallels to my own situation decades earlier. Yes, she admitted. I believe in Axiom's mission, but this is personally important. To me, my brother lost his arm in military service. This began as a project to help him specifically. The symmetry with my own journey was remarkable. Just as I had joined Axiom with innovations developed during my education, Zoe had created something potentially transformative, driven by personal motivation rather than corporate directive. Let me tell you a story, I said, leaning back in my chair, about how Axiom's approach to intellectual property began, and why it matters more than you might realize. I recounted the unconventional agreement Mason and I had structured in the company's early days, how my retention of patent ownership paired with exclusive licensing had created a balance of mutual respect and shared purpose that ultimately saved the company during the crisis with Jessica. That initial arrangement didn't just protect my innovations, I explained. It established a principle that has shaped Axiom's culture ever since: recognition that innovation emerges from individuals even within collective enterprises, and that respecting that individual contribution strengthens rather than weakens the whole. Zoe listened intently, connecting this history to her current dilemma. So, what would you suggest? She asked when I finished. Draft a proposal, I replied. Not just for the technology itself, but for how you envision its development, ownership, and application. Include a licensing structure that protects your personal connection to the innovation while ensuring Axiom can develop it responsibly. She nodded thoughtfully. And you think Jessica will be receptive? I smiled at the irony. Jessica, better than almost anyone, understands the value of this approach. What began as a conflict between us has become a cornerstone of how Axiom operates. 2 weeks later, Jessica, Kenneth, and I gathered in the boardroom to review Zoe's proposal. The presentation was comprehensive and compelling, detailing both the technology's potential and a governance structure that balanced personal ownership with corporate development. Jessica studied the licensing arrangement with particular attention. This resembles the original agreement between you and my father, she observed, glancing at me. The parallel occurred to me as well, I acknowledged. After thorough questioning and discussion, Jessica turned to Zoe with unexpected warmth. 15. Years ago, I would have rejected this outright, she admitted candidly. I would have seen personal patent ownership as a threat to corporate control. She glanced at me, a silent acknowledgement of our shared history. What I've learned since then, she continued, is that innovation thrives on recognition and respect. Your proposal honors both your personal connection to this technology and Axiom's role in developing it. I support it completely. Kenneth, too, endorsed the approach. What's most exciting to me is how this opens a new frontier for Axiom, adaptive technology that directly improves human lives. It's a natural evolution from environmental monitoring to human well-being. With unanimous leadership approval, Axiom Medical was established as the company's newest division, with Zoe as its founding director. The neural interface technology became the cornerstone of a new patent portfolio, structured under the same principles that had guided Axiom since its earliest days. Within 18 months, the first prototype neural adaptive prosthetic arm was being tested by a select group of veterans, including Zoe's brother. The results exceeded even the most optimistic projections, with users reporting unprecedented levels of sensory feedback and motor control. As Axiom Medical gained momentum, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the journey that had brought us to this point. What seemed at the time like the worst moment of my professional life, being fired by Jessica after 15 years of dedicated service, had ultimately been the catalyst for everything that followed. Had she not fired me, the unique patent arrangement would have remained a private agreement between Mason and myself, never tested by crisis or formalized into corporate governance. Jessica might never have evolved beyond the entitled heir she once was. Kenneth might never have found a way to align his environmental passion with the family business. And Axiom itself might have remained merely successful rather than transformative on the 25th anniversary of my firing, a date I now marked with appreciation rather than resentment. I invited Jessica and Kenneth to dinner at the small Italian restaurant where Mason and I had celebrated Axiom's first major contract. The location held significance for me, though neither of them had been part of the company during those early struggles. "Do you realize," I said once we were settled with glasses of wine, "that today marks exactly 25 years since you escorted me out of the building?" Jessica winced slightly at the memory. "Not my finest moment." "Actually," I corrected her, "I've come to see it as one of the most important days in Axiom's history." Kenneth raised an eyebrow, curious. "How so?" "Think about it," I explained. Had Jessica not fired me, the patent ownership arrangement would have remained a private matter between Mason and myself. It would never have been tested, never evolved into a governance principle, never shaped the company's approach to innovation. Jessica considered this perspective. I was operating from such a limited understanding then. I saw leadership as control rather than stewardship. And yet, I pointed out, that very mistake created the crisis that ultimately transformed both you and the company. Sometimes our worst decisions lead to our greatest growth. Kenneth raised his glass. "To constructive crises, then." We clinked. Glasses. Three people whose paths had converged in ways none of us could have anticipated. "There's something I've never told you," Jessica said after a moment. "About that day when I fired you." I looked at her curiously. "What's that?" "After you left, I found a letter in my father's desk. It was addressed to me, to be opened if there was ever conflict between us." She paused, the memory clearly still emotional. "It detailed your patent arrangement and explained how central you were to Axiom's success. He had anticipated the possibility of tension once I took over." "Then you did know about the patents when you fired me," I said, not accusingly, but with newfound understanding. Jessica nodded, meeting my eyes directly. "I knew, but I didn't believe it mattered. I thought corporate authority trumped individual rights. I couldn't imagine that papers signed years earlier could override my position as CEO." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Kenneth asked his sister. "Shame," she admitted simply. "It was easier to let people think I had made an uninformed mistake, rather than a willfully arrogant one." Her candor was striking, a measure of how far she had come from the defensive, entitled person she had once been. "The truth is," she continued, "I needed that humbling. I needed to learn that leadership isn't bestowed through titles, but earned through wisdom and respect. As our dinner continued, we shifted from reminiscence to future vision. Kenneth shared his plans for expanding Axiom Earth's capabilities to address emerging climate challenges. Jessica outlined her strategy for integrating the company's divisions more seamlessly while preserving their distinct cultures. I described the mentorship program I was developing to ensure Axiom's innovative spirit continued beyond any individual's tenure. What struck me most about the conversation was how each of us had found our authentic contribution to Mason's legacy. Jessica had evolved into the steward of corporate integrity he had hoped she would become. Kenneth had expanded the definition of what Axiom could achieve beyond purely commercial success. And I had transformed from employee to partner to mentor, carrying forward the principles that had guided us from the beginning. As we finished our meal, Jessica surprised me with a small wooden box. Inside was a vintage mechanical watch, specifically the one Mason had worn throughout his career. "Dad left this for you," she explained, "with instructions that I should give it to you when I truly understand why." I lifted the timepiece carefully, noting the scratches and wear that spoke of decades of use during Mason's years building the company from nothing. "And do you?" I asked. "Understand why?" Jessica nodded, her expression reflective. "He wanted me to recognize that time itself is the most valuable patent any of us owns. How we invest it, who we share it with, what we build together. That's the true measure of success." The insight revealed how completely Jessica had internalized her father's values, transforming them from inherited wisdom to lived experience. 2 months after our anniversary dinner, we gathered for the official launch of Axiom Medical's first commercial product, the Neurolink prosthetic system. The auditorium was filled with stakeholders ranging from investors to medical professionals to veterans who had participated in the clinical trials. Zoe Patterson, now a confident executive, in her own right, delivered the keynote address. Her brother sat in the front row, the advanced prosthetic arm allowing him a range of motion and sensitivity that would have seemed miraculous just years earlier. "Innovation doesn't emerge from corporations," Zoe said toward the end of her presentation. "It emerges from people with personal connections to problems that need solving. What makes Axiom unique isn't just what we build, but how we honor the human dimension of innovation." She gestured toward me seated in the audience. "The governance structure that makes Axiom Medical possible began decades ago with one person, refusing to separate their creations from their values. That principle has created a company where technical brilliance and human dignity reinforce rather than oppose each other." As I listened to Zoe articulate so clearly what had evolved organically, over decades I felt a profound sense of completion. The unconventional patent arrangement that had once been merely a practical solution between a struggling company and an ambitious engineer had matured into a philosophical foundation for ethical innovation. Mason Warren had built a company. Jessica had transformed it into a corporate exemplar. Kenneth had expanded its purpose beyond profit. And generations of innovators like Zoe would continue extending its impact in directions none of us could fully anticipate. The crisis that began with my firing had catalyzed all of this, not because patents provided leverage in a corporate power struggle, but because our conflict forced us to articulate values that might otherwise have remained implicit. As I approach the final chapter of my professional life, I've come to see that ownership itself is a nuanced concept. We speak of owning companies, patents, innovations, but the most valuable forms of ownership transcend legal frameworks. They're about the authentic connection between creators and their creations, between leaders and their missions, between individuals and their impact on the world. The boss's daughter who fired me after I built the company to $50 million had no idea I owned the patents that kept the business alive. But through that crisis, all of us learned a more profound truth. The most valuable things we create aren't patents or products or even companies, but principles that outlast any individual contribution. That legacy continues to unfold in ways that honor its foundations while embracing new horizons, exactly as it should, exactly as Mason would have wanted, and exactly as Jessica, Kenneth, and I now understand it must. The success of Axiom Medical's Neurolink prosthetic system attracted attention far beyond our traditional industry circles. Within 2 years of launch, the technology had been fitted to over 5,000 patients, with clinical outcomes that transformed not just physical capabilities, but psychological well-being. Veterans who had struggled with conventional prosthetics reported unprecedented levels of function and reduced phantom limb pain. What began as Zoe Patterson's personal mission to help her brother had evolved into a movement that was redefining adaptive technology. Much like my sensor innovations decades earlier, her neural interface patents represented more than technical achievements. They embodied a philosophy about how technology could serve humanity. As Axiom approached its 40th anniversary, the board began discussions about succession planning. Jessica was nearing traditional retirement age, though she showed no signs of slowing down. Kenneth remained deeply engaged with Axiom Earth, but had begun dividing his time between operational leadership and advocacy work with international environmental organizations. I had already stepped back from day-to-day operations, though I maintained my role as chairman and continued mentoring promising innovators throughout the company. At 67, I found myself increasingly drawn to the educational aspects of leadership, passing on not just technical knowledge, but the values and principles that had guided Axiom through decades of evolution. During a quarterly strategy meeting, Jessica surprised everyone with an unexpected proposal. "I believe it's time we formalize Axiom's approach to innovation and intellectual property," she began. "What started as an arrangement between my father and Ethan has evolved into something more significant. A governance model that balances individual creativity with collective purpose." She outlined what she called the Axiom Innovation Charter, a comprehensive framework that would institutionalize the principles that had emerged organically over 4 decades. The charter would establish clear protocols for how individual contributors could maintain meaningful connection to their innovations, while ensuring the company could develop and deploy those innovations at scale. "This isn't just about patents or licensing agreements," Jessica explained. "It's about recognizing that the most powerful innovations emerge from authentic human connections to problems worth solving. Our job as an organization is to nurture those connections, not sever them through corporate absorption." Kenneth immediately endorsed the concept. "What makes this particularly important now is our scale," he added. "When Axiom was smaller, these principles could be maintained through personal relationships and shared understanding. At our current size, with over 2,000 employees across 3 divisions, we need explicit structures to preserve what makes our culture unique." The board unanimously approved the development of the charter, with one addition from an unexpected source. Zoe Patterson, who had recently joined the board representing Axiom Medical, suggested the charter include a mentorship requirement. "Every innovator whose patents become central to Axiom's product lines should be paired with emerging talent," she proposed. "Not just for technical knowledge transfer, but to pass on the ethos behind the innovation. Technology can be reverse-engineered. Values must be deliberately transmitted." The suggestion resonated deeply with me. While I had naturally gravitated toward mentorship in my later career, formalizing this aspect would ensure the continuity of Axiom's unique approach beyond any individual's tenure. Over the following months, a working group that spanned all 3 divisions collaborated to articulate the charter. The process itself proved as valuable as the resulting document, forcing us to make explicit the implicit values that had guided the company through multiple transformations. The final charter was unveiled at a company-wide gathering commemorating Axiom's 40th anniversary. The venue was significant. We had returned to the converted warehouse where Mason had started the company and where I had joined him during those precarious early days. Though now surrounded by modern office buildings, the original structure had been preserved as a conference and innovation center. Jessica, Kenneth, and I shared the stage, along with Zoe and representatives from each division. Together, we presented not just the charter itself, but the journey that had inspired it. From Mason's original vision, through the crisis that had tested our values, to the multi-division enterprise we had become. What makes Axiom unique isn't our technology, though we're justifiably proud of our innovations, Jessica told the assembled employees. What makes us unique is our understanding that meaningful innovation emerges from the authentic connection between creators and their creations, between problems and the people who care deeply enough to solve them. Kenneth followed, emphasizing how this philosophy had allowed Axiom to expand beyond its original market focus without losing its essential character. When I proposed repurposing our sensor technology for environmental protection, I was an outsider to this company. The fact that my vision found fertile ground here speaks to a culture that values purpose alongside profit. When my turn came, I focused on the journey rather than the destination. The Axiom Innovation Charter formalizes principles that emerged through crisis and conflict, I explained. What began as a practical arrangement between a struggling company and an ambitious engineer evolved through challenge into something more profound, a model for how organizations can foster innovation while honoring the human dimension of creativity. Zoe concluded the presentation by looking forward. As someone who joined Axiom long after these founding principles were established, I can attest to their power in attracting and retaining talent. People choose Axiom not just for career advancement, but because we offer something increasingly rare in the corporate world: the opportunity to maintain meaningful connection to one's creative contributions. The charter itself addressed everything, from initial patent agreements to ongoing recognition, from mentorship requirements to ethical application guidelines. But its essence could be distilled to a simple principle: innovation emerges from individuals, thrives through collaboration, and endures through shared purpose. Following the ceremonial signing of the charter, the gathering transitioned to a more personal commemoration. Current and former employees shared stories that illustrated Axiom's evolution, from the desperate early days when we celebrated securing enough orders to make payroll to the present reality as a multi-billion-dollar enterprise spanning 3 distinct sectors. Carlos Rodriguez, now retired but still vibrant in his 70s, recounted the infamous coffee pot incident when an experimental sensor array accidentally overloaded the building's electrical system, plunging us into darkness. During a crucial client demonstration, Mason just lit his phone flashlight, kept talking like nothing had happened, and closed the deal anyway. That's when I knew this place was special. Sarah Mitchell, who had handled everything from accounting to customer service in those early days, reminded everyone how Mason had refused acquisition offers even when the company was struggling financially. He always said he wasn't building Axiom to sell it. He was building it to matter. As the stories continued, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey from my firing to this moment of institutional codification. What had felt like professional catastrophe had ultimately been the crucible in which Axiom's most distinctive qualities were forged and tested. The following morning, I received an unexpected visitor at my home office, Dr. Eleanor Chen of TechCore, now in her 80s but still serving as chairman emeritus of the conglomerate that had evolved from corporate predator to valued partner. "I hope you don't mind the unscheduled visit," she said as we settled in my study. "I wanted to deliver this in person." She handed me an elegant bound volume, a limited edition history of technological innovation in the early 21st century. Opening it, I found an entire chapter dedicated to Axiom's governance model and its influence on a new generation of technology companies. "Your approach to innovation has spread far beyond your own organization," Dr. Chen explained. "Remember, when I told you years ago that TechCore was reconsidering its acquisition strategy because of your rejection? That was just the beginning." She described how the Axiom model, as it had become known in business schools, had influenced a generation of emerging technology firms. The emphasis on maintaining connection between innovators and their creations, on balancing individual recognition with collective application had proven particularly resonant in an era when talent retention had become the primary challenge for knowledge-based enterprises. What began as a practical arrangement between you and Mason Warren has become something of a movement, Dr. Chen observed, particularly among companies focused on solving meaningful problems rather than simply chasing market share. Her validation of Axiom's approach from outside our organizational boundaries struck me as particularly significant. What we had built wasn't just a successful company, but a template that others could adapt and evolve. After Dr. Chen departed, I found myself drawn to the small home workshop where I still tinkered with experimental designs despite my semi-retirement. On the wall hung the framed original patent for the sensor calibration system that had transformed Axiom's fortunes, the innovation at the center of our long-ago conflict. Next to it hung something equally meaningful, a handwritten note Mason had left me after our first major success, when a client order had finally pulled the company back from the brink of bankruptcy. "Ownership isn't about control," he had written. "It's about responsibility to something larger than yourself." The time, I had interpreted the message narrowly, as encouragement to remain committed to Axiom despite its precarious position. Only years later, after the crisis with Jessica and the subsequent transformation of the company, did I grasp its deeper significance. True ownership, whether of patents, companies, or ideas, wasn't about legal control or financial benefit. It was about the responsibility to ensure that what you create serves its highest purpose, that the values embedded in its creation endure beyond your individual contribution. That evening, I received a call from Zoe Patterson. "I've been thinking about the next evolution of Neuralink," she began without preamble, characteristic of her direct approach. "The current application focuses on replacing lost function, but the underlying technology has potential for augmentation as well." She outlined a vision for neural interfaces that could provide enhanced capabilities for individuals with intact but limited physical function, particularly children with developmental coordination disorders and adults with degenerative conditions. "The regulatory hurdles would be substantial," she acknowledged, "and the ethical considerations even more complex, but the potential benefit justifies the challenges." As I listened to Zoe articulate her vision, I was struck by the parallels to my own journey. Just as my initial sensor innovations had evolved far beyond their original applications, her neural interface technology was revealing possibilities that transcended its original purpose. "You're not just continuing your original innovation," I observed when she finished. "You're expanding its purpose." "That's the point, isn't it?" she replied. "Innovation isn't static. It evolves as our understanding deepens." Her insight captured something essential about Axiom's 4-decade journey. What began as a struggling manufacturer of industrial testing equipment had evolved into a multi-sector enterprise spanning environmental protection, medical technology, and our original precision sensors, not through abandoning our foundations, but through expanding their application. 2 months after the charter signing, Jessica called a special board meeting to discuss succession planning. Though she had shown no signs of stepping back from her role as CEO, she believed in designing the future rather than reacting to it. "I've been privileged to lead Axiom through a remarkable period of growth and transformation," she began. "But no individual should become indispensable to an organization's continued success." She proposed a 3-year transition plan in which leadership responsibilities would be gradually transferred to the next generation. Rather than simply appointing successors, she suggested a process through which emerging leaders would rotate through divisions, ensuring comprehensive understanding of Axiom's integrated operations. "What I've come to appreciate," Jessica explained, "is that Axiom isn't merely 3 distinct divisions sharing a corporate structure. It's an integrated ecosystem where each component strengthens the others." Kenneth nodded in agreement. "The environmental monitoring technology we developed for Axiom Earth informed the sensor miniaturization that made Neuralink possible. The data processing innovations from medical have enhanced our environmental pattern recognition. These connections aren't accidental. They're the result of our shared innovation culture. The plan Jessica outlined was characteristically thorough, addressing everything from knowledge transfer to client relationship transitions. But what impressed me most was her emphasis on values continuity alongside operational handover. Technical expertise can be documented and transferred, she noted. Cultural values must be demonstrated and embodied. That's why this transition isn't simply about identifying successors, but about ensuring they understand why Axiom operates as it does, not just how. As the meeting concluded, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey we had all taken. Jessica, once the entitled heir who had fired me in a misguided attempt to assert control, had evolved into a leader whose understanding of stewardship transcended mere management. Kenneth, initially disconnected from his father's business, had expanded its purpose in ways none of us could have anticipated. And I had transformed from employee to partner to mentor, carrying forward principles that would outlast any individual's tenure. What began in crisis, my firing after building the company to $50 million, the revelation that I owned the patents that kept it alive, had evolved through conflict and collaboration into something far more significant than corporate success. We had created not just a thriving enterprise, but a model for how innovation could serve both individual fulfillment and collective purpose. Mason Warren's original vision had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, not because we abandoned his founding principles, but because we applied them to new frontiers. The patents that had been at the center of our conflict were now just one element in a governance philosophy that balanced individual creativity with shared mission. As I walk through Axiom's headquarters today, watching a new generation of innovators building upon foundations laid decades earlier, I'm struck by a profound truth. The most valuable things we create aren't products or patents or even companies, but principles that transcend their original context. Principles that continue evolving long after we've moved on. The boss's daughter who fired me after I built the company to $50 million had no idea I owned the patents that kept it alive. But through that crucible of conflict, we all discovered something more valuable than legal ownership or corporate control. The understanding that true innovation emerges from the authentic connection between creators and their creations, between problems and the people who care deeply enough to solve them. That understanding continues to guide Axiom's evolution, ensuring that what began as a practical arrangement between a struggling company and an ambitious engineer will endure as a legacy that transcends any individual contribution, exactly as it should. 30 years after joining Axiom Technologies. As a desperate graduate with crushing student debt, I finally retired from active leadership. My 70th birthday seemed an appropriate milestone to transition fully from chairman to emeritus advisor, though I maintained my position on the foundation board at Jessica and Kenneth's insistence. The company that had begun in a leaking warehouse with mismatched furniture now occupied a sprawling campus on the outskirts of Columbus. The original 3 employees had grown to over 5,000 across 12 countries. Annual revenue exceeded $5 billion, with Axiom's 3 divisions, industrial, earth, and medical, each thriving in their respective sectors. My retirement celebration was held in the campus atrium, beneath a living wall of plants that served as both art installation and air purification system. The space embodied Axiom's evolution, technologically innovative, yet fundamentally humane, blending engineering precision with ecological awareness. Jessica, now CEO for nearly 3 decades, delivered the first toast. At 55, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her position rather than inherited it. The entitled heir who had once fired me was long gone, replaced by a leader whose name regularly appeared on lists of the most respected executives in the country. When I took over Axiom after my father's heart attack, she began, I thought leadership meant asserting control, What I've learned since then, largely through Ethan's example, is that true leadership means creating conditions where others can contribute their best work. She raised her glass in my direction. The patents that sparked our conflict 3 decades ago became the foundation for something far more valuable than intellectual property rights. They became a framework for honoring individual contribution within collective purpose. Kenneth followed with his own remarks. At 50, he had transformed from the reluctant inheritor into a globally recognized advocate for technology-driven conservation. Axiom Earth now protected over 200 million acres of critical habitat worldwide, with monitoring systems that had become the global standard for environmental enforcement. My father built a company, Kenneth said. Ethan and Jessica transformed it into an institution. What began as precision sensors for industrial testing has evolved into technology that protects both our planet and its people. As the celebration continued, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner where Zoe Patterson stood observing the proceedings. In the decade since launching Axiom Medical, she had grown from promising engineer to visionary executive. The neural interface, technology she had developed out of love for her brother, now helped thousands of people reclaim capabilities they had lost through injury or illness. Feeling reflective? She asked as I joined her. Inevitably, I admitted. Events like this naturally prompt thoughts about journeys and destinations. Zoe nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that first conversation in your office, when I came to you about neural interface technology. How different things might have been if you'd taken a conventional approach to intellectual property. You mean if I'd insisted the company owned everything you developed? I clarified. Exactly. I might have held back the innovation entirely, or taken it elsewhere, or pushed forward without the personal connection that made it meaningful. Her observation captured precisely why Axiom's approach to innovation had proven so powerful. By honoring the human source of technical creativity, we had created a culture where people brought their whole selves to their work, including the personal motivations that often drove the most transformative ideas. The greatest innovations often emerge from deeply personal motivations, I noted. Your brother's injury, Mason's commitment to building something meaningful after 30 years in manufacturing, my own desire to see my graduate research actually make a difference in the world. And now, Zoe added, the Axiom Innovation Framework is being taught in business schools as an alternative to traditional corporate ownership models. She referred to the formalized system that had evolved from my original patent arrangement with Mason. Over the decades, what began as a practical solution between a cash-strapped company and an ambitious engineer had matured into a sophisticated approach to intellectual property that balanced individual recognition with collective development. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest, Dr. Eleanor Chen of TechCore, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever. Our partnership had endured through multiple technology cycles, evolving from straightforward licensing to deep collaboration across multiple domains. I wouldn't have missed this, she said warmly, embracing me. You fundamentally changed how we approach innovation at TechCore. How so? I asked, genuinely curious. Before our partnership with Axiom, we followed the traditional corporate model. Company owns everything, innovators get a salary and maybe a bonus. After seeing how your approach unleashed creativity and loyalty, we restructured our entire R&D governance. It was a profound testament to the ripple effects of decisions made decades earlier. What began as a conflict over patent ownership had influenced not just Axiom, but even our much larger partner. As the evening progressed, I found myself drawn to the memorial garden where Mason's ashes had been scattered following his wishes. The space, designed by Kenneth, featured native Ohio plants interspersed with subtle sensor arrays that monitored ecological health, a fitting tribute to both Mason's engineering background and his son's environmental vision. Jessica joined me there, away from the celebration's bustle. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both paying respect to the man who had brought us together through very different connections. Do you ever wonder, she asked finally. What Dad would think of what Axiom has become. I considered the question carefully. I think he'd be amazed by the scale and scope of what we've built, but I think he'd be most proud of how we built it, the values that have guided our growth. Jessica nodded, her expression reflective. The older I get, the more I understand what he was trying to teach me. It wasn't about the company as an asset to be inherited. It was about stewardship of something larger than any individual. That's the lesson that transformed you from heir to leader, I observed. She smiled ruefully. A lesson I learned the hard way by nearly destroying what he built. Crisis reveals character, I reminded her, echoing Mason's wisdom from decades earlier. Sometimes we need to be broken open to grow beyond our limitations. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Melissa Warren, Jessica's daughter, who had recently joined Axiom after completing her PhD in biophysics. At 28, she embodied a fascinating blend of her family's characteristics: Mason's engineering precision, Jessica's strategic mind, and Kenneth's ecological awareness. There you are, she said, approaching us. They're about to unveil the surprise. The surprise, I soon learned, was the establishment of the Ethan Reynolds Innovation Fellowship, a program that would identify promising engineers from disadvantaged backgrounds and provide not just education funding but mentorship and resources to develop their ideas. The fellowship will embody the principles that have guided Axiom since its founding, Jessica announced to the assembled guests. Recognition that innovation emerges from individuals with unique perspectives and personal motivations. Support that nurtures those innovations within a collaborative framework. And governance that honors both individual contribution and collective purpose. I was deeply moved by the initiative, particularly because it addressed something I had long believed: that technological innovation was too often limited by access rather than talent. How many brilliant ideas remained undeveloped because promising minds lacked resources, mentorship, or opportunity? The fellowship's first recipient was already selected: Darius Wilson, a remarkable young engineer from Southside Chicago who had developed an advanced water filtration system for his community, using salvaged materials and self-taught principles. His innovation, refined with proper resources, had the potential to provide clean water in regions affected by industrial contamination. As Darius described his journey and vision, I saw in him echoes of my own path decades earlier: the ambition, the technical creativity, and most importantly, the personal connection to his innovation's purpose. His filtration system wasn't merely a technical solution. It was his response to watching family members suffer from health issues linked to contaminated water. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, I found myself in conversation with Darius, Jessica, and Melissa, representing 3 generations of Axiom's evolution. The thing I'm most curious about, Darius said, looking between Jessica and me, is how you moved past the conflict that started all this. How do you go from firing someone to partnering with them to build something extraordinary? It was a perceptive question that cut to the heart of Axiom's journey. Jessica answered first. By recognizing that being right matters less than doing right. I was legally within my authority to fire Ethan, but morally and ethically wrong in how I approached leadership. When that became clear, I had a choice: defend my pride or build something meaningful. From my perspective, I added, it was about distinguishing between the conflict itself and the principles at stake. The firing was personal, but the patent arrangement represented something larger: the proper relationship between individual innovation and institutional development. Melissa, who had grown up hearing versions of this founding story, offered her own observation. What strikes me is how the crisis forced explicit articulation of values that might otherwise have remained implicit. Without that conflict, would Axiom have developed the innovation framework that now defines it? Her insight was remarkably astute. Crisis had indeed served as the crucible in which Axiom's defining values had been refined from implicit understanding to explicit governance. Without that painful catalyst, the principles Mason and I had intuitively followed might never have been formalized into the system that now guided the company. As the evening concluded, I found myself back in the memorial garden, this time alone with my thoughts. I recalled the desperate young engineer who had walked into Mason's converted warehouse 30 years earlier, hoping merely for a job that would help address my student debt. I could never have imagined the journey that would unfold from that beginning. The patents that had been at the center of our conflict now numbered over 200, with my name on the earliest and most fundamental ones. Yet their true significance had never been about legal ownership or financial benefit. They had become the foundation for a philosophy of innovation that balanced individual creativity with collective purpose. The following morning, I visited Axiom's headquarters one last time before departing for a long-planned journey, a year of travel to visit Axiom installations across the globe. From rainforest monitoring stations in Brazil to medical centers in India, where our neural interface technology was being implemented. In the main lobby, beneath Mason's bronze statue, a new installation had been unveiled. A wall displaying the names of every patent holder in Axiom's history, arranged chronologically from my first sensor calibration innovation to the most recent breakthroughs in neural interfaces and environmental monitoring. Jessica joined me as I studied the display, which visualized the company's intellectual evolution over 3 decades. This was Kenneth's idea, she explained. A way to honor both the individual contributions and the collective progress they represent. What struck me most powerfully was how the display captured Axiom's unique approach to innovation. Each patent was credited to its specific inventors, recognizing their individual creativity, yet arranged to show how each built upon those that came before, illustrating the collaborative nature of progress. "It's perfect," I said simply. "It captures exactly what makes Axiom different." As I prepared to leave, Jessica handed me a small package. "A going-away present," she explained. "Something to take with you on your travels." Inside was a beautifully crafted journal bound in sustainable leather, with Axiom's logo subtly embossed on the cover. The first page bore a handwritten note, in Jessica's precise script. "For new chapters and continuing wisdom. The story that began with conflict has evolved into something neither of us could have imagined. Thank you for teaching me that true ownership isn't about control, but about contribution. Jessica." The gesture perfectly encapsulated how far we had come from those contentious days 3 decades earlier. What began with security escorting me from the building had evolved into profound partnership and mutual respect. As I traveled, over the subsequent year, visiting Axiom installations across 6 continents, I used Jessica's journal to record not just observations, but reflections on the journey that had brought us to this point. At each location, whether an environmental monitoring station in the Serengeti or a medical center in Mumbai, I witnessed the tangible impact of principles established decades earlier. In the Amazon rainforest, where Kenneth's environmental vision had first taken concrete form, I spent time with indigenous rangers who used Axiom's monitoring technology to protect their ancestral lands from illegal logging and mining. One evening, sitting around a fire with these guardians of the forest, their leader asked me a question that cut to the heart of Axiom's philosophy. "Your sensors help us protect our land," he said through a translator. "But the most important thing you brought was respect for our knowledge of the forest. Your engineers listened to us instead of just installing their machines." His observation captured precisely what made Axiom's approach different. The technology was powerful, but its effectiveness came from integration with human wisdom, the ranger's generational knowledge of the ecosystem combined with modern sensing capabilities. This same principle was evident at the Rehabilitation Center in Delhi, where Zoe's neural interface technology helped patients recover capabilities lost to injury or illness. The medical staff emphasized that the technology's power came not from the devices themselves, but from how they were integrated into holistic treatment approaches that honored each patient's unique circumstances and goals. As my journey neared its end, I received news that Darius Wilson, the first Ethan Reynolds Fellow, had developed his water filtration system into a scalable platform being implemented in communities across 3 continents. The innovation that began as his response to a local problem had evolved into a global solution through the support of Axiom's resources and mentorship. Upon returning to Columbus, I found the company continuing to evolve in my absence. Jessica was preparing her own transition, with plans to step aside as CEO within 5 years. Melissa Warren had been appointed to lead Axiom Earth following Kenneth's semi-retirement. And Zoe Patterson was expanding Axiom Medical into new domains of assistive technology. What struck me most powerfully was how the principles established during our earliest conflict had created a foundation strong enough to support multiple generations of growth and evolution. The patents that had once been at the center of our dispute had long since expired, yet the governance framework they inspired continued to guide Axiom's development. The boss's daughter who fired me after I built the company to $50 million had no idea I owned the patents that kept the enterprise alive. But that crisis had forced us all to articulate values that might otherwise have remained implicit, creating a legacy far more valuable than any intellectual property rights. This legacy continues to unfold in ways that honor its foundations while embracing new horizons, exactly as it should, exactly as Mason would have wanted, and exactly as all of us who helped build it now understand it must. 40 years after walking into Mason Warren's leaking warehouse as a desperate MIT graduate, I found myself addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos. At 75, I had been invited to speak about what had become known as the Axiom model, an approach to innovation governance that balanced individual contribution with collective development. The journey from that warehouse to this global stage encapsulated more than just my personal story or even Axiom's corporate evolution. It represented a fundamental shift in how we understood the relationship between innovators and institutions, a shift that had influenced industries, educational systems, and even government research agencies around the world. As I looked out at the assembled leaders from business, government, and civil society, I reflected on how different this moment was from the day Jessica Warren had fired me after 15 years of dedicated service. What had begun as a personal crisis had catalyzed principles that now shaped how organizations across the globe approached innovation. The patents that sparked our original conflict have long since expired, I began, addressing the core of what had brought me to this platform. But the question they raised remains perpetually relevant. How do we honor individual creativity while fostering collective progress? The global response to what became known as the Axiom Innovation Framework had been remarkable. Over 500 major corporations had adopted variations of our model. Universities had restructured their approach to student and faculty innovations based on our principles. Even national research agencies had reformed their intellectual property policies to better balance individual recognition with public benefit. After my address, a young entrepreneur from Kenya approached me. Her startup had developed a distributed solar power system that was transforming rural electrification across East Africa. "Your story changed how I structured my company," she told me. "Instead of following the traditional venture capital model, where founders lose control of their innovations, we created a governance system inspired by Axiom. Our engineers retain partial ownership of their innovations while the company develops and deploys them at scale." Her company wasn't unique. From Stockholm to Singapore, São Paulo to Sydney, organizations of all sizes had adapted Axiom's principles to their specific contexts. The fundamental insight that innovation thrives when individual contribution and institutional development are partners rather than opponents had proven universally applicable despite cultural and economic differences. Upon returning to Columbus from Davos, I found the Axiom campus transformed for a momentous occasion. Jessica, Warren's retirement after 35 years as CEO. At 65, she had overseen Axiom's growth from a struggling $50 million company to a $12 billion global enterprise with operations on every continent. The celebration was held in the company's newest building, an architectural marvel that embodied Axiom's integrated philosophy. The structure generated its own energy through Kenneth's environmental technologies, incorporated Zoe's neural interface systems for accessibility, and utilized the next generation of precision sensors that had evolved from my original innovations. Jessica's retirement speech revealed how completely she had internalized the lessons of our early conflict. "When I took over this company after my father's heart attack," she told the assembled employees and partners, "I mistook position for authority and control for leadership. What I've learned over 35 years is that true leadership isn't about exercising power, but about creating conditions where others can contribute their gifts." She gestured toward me in the front row. "The conflict that began our journey, firing Ethan despite his ownership of the patents that kept Axiom alive, forced us to articulate principles that might otherwise have remained implicit. Sometimes our worst decisions create our greatest opportunities for growth." Melissa Warren, now 43 and the incoming CEO, followed her mother with remarks that bridged generations. Having grown up with Axiom's story as family lore, then experienced its principles as an executive, she brought a unique perspective to the company's evolution. "The Axiom model isn't just a corporate governance structure," she observed. "It's a recognition that innovation emerges from human beings with personal motivations, unique perspectives, and inherent dignity. When we honor that reality rather than trying to subordinate it to institutional control, we create the conditions for both individual fulfillment and collective progress." Kenneth, Zoe, and I were called to join Jessica and Melissa on stage, 5 figures representing Axiom's generational evolution. The visual symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Mason's children, my protege, and myself standing together as partners rather than opponents. The retirement celebration transitioned into the Axiom Legacy Conference, a 3-day gathering that brought together innovation leaders from around the world to explore the principles that had evolved from our early conflict. Representatives from corporations, universities, government agencies, and nonprofits shared how they had adapted the Axiom model to their specific contexts. Darius Wilson, now in his 40s and the head of a global water technology enterprise that had grown from his fellowship project, delivered a particularly powerful address about the democratization of innovation. "The traditional model concentrated opportunity in privileged hands," he noted. "The Axiom approach recognizes that brilliant ideas emerge from all communities when given proper support and recognition. This isn't just about fairness, it's about unleashing human potential that would otherwise remain dormant." His observations struck at the heart of what had made the Axiom model so influential. By creating pathways for innovators regardless of background, we had tapped into vast reservoirs of creativity that traditional corporate structures often excluded. The conference's final day featured a session on the future of the Axiom approach. As the panel moderator, I posed a provocative question. How do we ensure these principles evolve rather than calcify as institutional dogma? Melissa Warren's response captured the essence of what Mason had built and what we had all helped evolve. "The Axiom model isn't a fixed structure but a living philosophy," she explained. "Its power comes not from rigid adherence to particular mechanisms, but from fidelity to fundamental principles. That innovation emerges from individuals with personal connections to problems. That recognition of contribution fosters rather than hinders collective progress, and that governance should balance individual creativity with institutional development." Following the conference, I spent an evening with Jessica, Kenneth, and Zoe at Mason's Memorial Garden, now a mature ecosystem with towering native trees and vibrant undergrowth. We had gathered to mark an occasion that felt simultaneously like An ending and a beginning. Jessica's retirement and Melissa's ascension. Do you remember when we sat in that Italian restaurant 20 years ago? Jessica asked me, referring to our dinner marking the 25th anniversary of my firing. I told you then that I had found Dad's letter warning me about the patent arrangement before I fired you. I nodded, recalling her confession that she had acted out of arrogance rather than ignorance. What I didn't tell you, she continued, was that I found another letter after his death, one addressed to both of us together. From her bag, she produced a worn envelope, the paper yellowed with age. I've been waiting for the right moment to share this. Today seems appropriate. The letter, written in Mason's distinctive engineer's script, was dated shortly before his passing. To Jessica and Ethan, by the time you read this, the conflict that nearly destroyed what we built will be long resolved. The company that began in a leaking warehouse with 3 employees will have evolved in ways I cannot fully imagine. What I hope you've discovered is that Axiom was never merely about precision sensors or testing equipment, or even the patents that protect our innovations. It was about creating a framework where technical expertise and human values could reinforce rather than oppose each other. Jessica, I knew you would need to learn leadership through crisis rather than instruction. Your intelligence and ambition required not just information, but transformation. Ethan, your commitment to both innovation and integrity provided the perfect catalyst for that growth. The patent arrangement that sparked your conflict was never just a practical solution to our early financial constraints. It was an expression of a deeper principle, that true progress emerges when we honor both individual contribution and collective purpose. My greatest hope is that you've built something that transcends any single product, patent, or even person, a legacy of innovation with integrity that will continue to evolve long after all of us are gone. With profound gratitude for what you've both given to my life's work, Mason. We sat in silence after Jessica finished reading, each absorbing the revelation that Mason had anticipated not just our conflict, but its potential to catalyze something larger than either of us had initially imagined. He knew, Kenneth said finally. He understood that the tension between individual and institutional ownership would be the creative force behind Axiom's evolution. Not just Axioms, Zoe added. This philosophy has transformed how innovation is governed across industries and nations. As twilight settled over the garden, our conversation turned from the past to the future. Jessica spoke of her plans to work with the foundation, expanding educational opportunities for young engineers from underrepresented communities. Kenneth described his vision for integrating Axiom Earth's technologies with indigenous knowledge systems across continents. Zoe outlined Axiom Medical's expansion into areas of neural rehabilitation that seemed like science fiction just years earlier. What struck me most powerfully was how each of them had internalized the principles that emerged from our original conflict, adapting them to their specific domains while maintaining fidelity to the core insight that innovation thrives when we honor its human origins. The following morning, I visited Axiom's original patent wall, now expanded into an interactive exhibition that traced the company's intellectual evolution across 4 decades. Standing before the display, I found myself joined by an unexpected visitor, Dr. Amara Chen, daughter of Dr. Eleanor Chen and the current CEO of TechCore. My mother sends her regards, she said warmly. She wanted to attend Jessica's retirement, but her health wouldn't permit the journey. At 92, Eleanor Chen remained a towering figure in the technology industry, having transformed TechCore's approach to innovation governance based on principles she had observed at Axiom. Your mother once told me that our partnership changed how TechCore approached intellectual property, I recalled. Amara nodded. More than that, it changed how we understood innovation itself. Before partnering with Axiom, TechCore viewed creativity as a resource to be extracted and owned. After witnessing your approach, we came to see it as a relationship to be nurtured. Her observation captured the essence of what had made the Axiom model so influential. It wasn't merely a legal framework for managing intellectual property. It was a philosophical approach to honoring the human dimension of innovation. As my own, life enters its final chapters. I find myself reflecting on the journey that began with a desperate job interview in a leaking warehouse. The patents that sparked our conflict have long since entered the public domain. The products built on those innovations have been superseded by new technologies. Even Axiom itself has evolved beyond what any of us could have imagined in those early days. Yet the principles that emerged from our crisis have proven remarkably enduring. The recognition that innovation emerges from individuals with personal connections to problems. The understanding that honoring individual contributions strengthens rather than weakens collective progress. The insight that governance should balance recognition with development rather than subordinating one to the other. Last month, I attended the graduation ceremony for the 20th cohort of Ethan Reynolds Fellows, 50 brilliant young engineers from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in technology. As I watched them receive their certificates, I was struck by how many had developed innovations driven by personal experience, medical devices inspired by family members' conditions, environmental technologies addressing challenges in their communities, accessibility tools emerging from their own lived experiences. One fellow in particular, Maya Jackson from Detroit, had developed an urban agriculture system that transformed vacant lots into highly productive vertical gardens. Her innovation had emerged from witnessing food insecurity in her neighborhood and applying her engineering skills to address it directly. "Your story inspired me," she told me at the reception following the ceremony. "Not just the technical aspects, but the principle that innovation should maintain connection to its human purpose, rather than being separated from it through institutional control." Her observation captured precisely what had made the Axiom model so influential. By maintaining the connection between innovators and their creations, legally through our patent approach, culturally through our recognition systems, and structurally through our governance, we had preserved the human purpose that gives technology its meaning. As I approach my 80th birthday, I find myself increasingly drawn to Mason's memorial garden. Sometimes I sit alone, reflecting on the journey that transformed a crisis into a legacy. Other times I'm joined by Jessica, Kenneth, or Zoe, each bringing their unique perspective on Axiom's evolution. Occasionally, I encounter younger employees who know me primarily as a historical figure rather than a colleague. The engineer whose firing sparked principles that now guide their work. Yesterday, in a moment of perfect symmetry, I found myself sitting in the garden alongside Melissa Warren and Maya Jackson, the current CEO and a promising young innovator, representing Axiom's past, present, and future. "What advice would you give someone just beginning their innovation journey?" Maya asked me. I considered the question carefully, wanting to distill 4 decades of experience into something genuinely useful. Remember that patents, products, and even companies are ultimately vehicles for human purpose, I said finally. The true value of innovation isn't in legal ownership or market position, but in how it serves genuine needs and expresses authentic creativity. Melissa nodded in agreement. That's what my grandfather understood, even back in the leaking warehouse. That's what my mother learned through the crisis of firing you. And that's what continues to guide Axiom today. The boss's daughter who fired me after I built the company to $50 million had no idea I owned the patents that kept the enterprise alive. But through that crisis, we discovered principles more valuable than any intellectual property. Principles that have shaped not just Axiom's evolution, but transformed how organizations around the world approach innovation. This legacy continues to unfold in ways that honor its foundations while embracing new horizons, exactly as it should, exactly as Mason would have wanted, and exactly as all of us who helped build it now understand it must. As new generations of innovators continue this journey, They carry forward not just technical knowledge or business models, but a fundamental insight that the most powerful innovations emerge when we honor the human dimension of creativity, the personal connections, values, and purposes that give technology its meaning. That understanding, more than any patent, product, or profit, is the true legacy of what began in crisis and evolved into transformation. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories, ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.